Welcome to Module 2. This module is going to cover counselling theory. In this module, we're going to cover some of the basics of three main theories. These three theories underpin a lot of the kind of therapies that you'll become familiar with, and they'll help you begin to understand whether, as a counsellor, your focus is on the past through psychodynamic theory, the here and now with person-centered theory, or the future development of your client's desires and ambitions and goals through cognitive behavioural therapy. Just before we start delving into the main three theories, I'd like to just explain how they fit within the broad type of therapy you may or may not have heard of. I haven't listed everything here because there are literally hundreds of different types of therapy available. But remember, many of them have their origins based on the three theories we're going to cover. For me, a useful way to look at the different theories and types of therapies is to use the image of an umbrella. If you imagine the umbrella as the overall approach, which includes a particular way of providing therapy. So, for example, if you take a psychodynamic approach, you're focused on understanding the past and how this affects your behaviour today. Under each umbrella are the different therapies that have developed and evolved over time, but that all broadly accept some of the same key principles of the umbrella theory they come under. There are broadly 5 different approaches, and we are going to only look at 3 elements. We're going to look at psychodynamic, humanistic, and cognitive behavioural. So let's take a look at the first umbrella, psychodynamic approaches. Psychoanalysis and psychodynamic therapies. This approach focuses on changing a problematic behaviour, feeling, or thoughts by discovering their unconscious meanings and motivations. Psychoanalytically orientated theories are characterised by a close working partnership between the therapist and patient, and together they explore the past and develop understandings about how this is linked to current behaviour. Psychodynamic approaches underpin many other approaches, and although the therapies within counselling and psychology vary, many adopt the understanding that clients learn about themselves by exploring their own past experiences. So, psychodynamic theory is all about exploring the past to find answers and help explain a person's current behaviour. So what is psychodynamic theory? Psychodynamic theory is based on an understanding of the interrelationship between the conscious and unconscious mind, which determines a person's personality and motivation. Psychodynamic psychology emphasizes the study of psychological forces that sit behind human behaviour, feelings and emotions. You'll probably have heard of Sigmund Freud and his work in developing psychodynamic theory. And this was in between 1856 and 1939, so it was a little while ago, and some of his theories and things he talks about were very much part of the day in terms of how people viewed human behaviour. Freud talked about psychic power as the energy that fuels the mind and controls behaviour. He believed that current behaviour was an accumulation of all prior experiences, and he placed great importance on a person's early development. A child's early experiences, he believed, provided the foundations for the adult personality, with all its strengths and vulnerabilities. Freud did not believe that behaviour just happened by accident. So let's have a look at some of Freud's ideas that still have relevance today. Freud divided the mind into 3 parts: the unconscious, the preconscious, and the conscious mind. For Freud, the unconscious formed the very largest part of the mind, and he believed that this had an important bearing on the behaviour of people in daily life and the psychological distress that he saw demonstrated in his patients. The stored feelings, thoughts and experiences in the unconscious mind directly influence behaviour, but these are unknown to the patient. The person does not consciously understand why they react and behave as they do. So the role of therapy is to begin the process of bringing the unknown from the unconscious mind into the pre-conscious and conscious state. He described the pre-conscious state as when someone can recall something into the conscious mind. It's information about yourself, and this is just below the surface of consciousness. Freud believed that bringing feelings and thoughts from the unconscious and pre-conscious mind into conscious awareness relieved psychological distress. He saw this demonstrated in his hypnotherapy experiments on patients with hysteria. Freud believed that the human psyche consisted of different aspects of itself. He called these the id, the ego, and the superego. These compete for control over our behaviour. The id is impulsive, untamed, and has no regard for what is acceptable or reasonable. The driving force of the mind is driven by what he called the pleasure principle, and the innate desire to meet our basic human needs, including water, food, sex, and shelter. This also includes the death drive, a self-destructive impulse which drives us to the end of our life. The ego provides the balance and acts as an intermediary between the unreasonable id and the external reality. The ego tries to satisfy the id. The ego is self-centered and does not consider other people's needs. It uses psychological functions like speaking, memory, learning, and thinking to challenge the desires of the id. It acts basically on what he called the reality principle, and it accepts the limits of what can be obtained from the outside world. The superego is essentially the moral compass of a person's conscience. This feels compassion for others and tries to satisfy the needs of the id. The superego works to what he called the perfection principle. It acts on our conscience and filters out our behaviour. Freud believed that the tensions between the demands of the id, ego, and superego and the repression of our desires resulted in disruptions in the balance of our psyche, leading to anxiety and repressed feelings. These repressed feelings sit in our unconscious mind, and through talking therapy we aim to bring these unconscious feelings into consciousness. Once we bring them into our conscious mind, we can begin to understand them and make sense of them. Modern psychodynamic concepts have developed this work further, developing ego states and psychoanalytical concepts on how to resolve conflict between parts of ourself. The terms ego-led, superego-led, and id-led are still used today to provide insight into clients' mental state and to help us make diagnosis around abnormal and normal behaviour, neurotic behaviour, and psychopathic tendencies. The psychodynamic approach allows a mutual sense of discovery, with the therapist and the client working together to gain an understanding of past experiences and the impact that these have on the client's here and now. The client is provided with a safe environment to explore their past, and this is made possible by the presence of the core conditions of unconditional positive regard, congruence, and non-judgment. We're going to cover these three areas in a bit more detail with the next theory. Psychodynamic theory places great emphasis and highlights the need to watch for defences and resistance from the client. The belief is that this can provide insights into the difficulties someone is having and the strategies they have adopted to avoid experiencing anxiety or distress. The array of defences and resistance presented by the client can uncover why they act out and avoid saying how they truly feel to people important to them. They also give insight into why some people intellectualize their feelings, and also how they relate to them in an abstract way, or indeed why some people rationalize their behaviour and defend it. The understanding of these and other defense mechanisms help the therapist and client gain knowledge about the client's past. Psychodynamic theory respects and accepts defenses and resistance the clients exhibit. The understanding of these and other defense mechanisms help the therapist gain knowledge about the client's past, helping the client make connections with their past experiences and their current behaviour. For example, the client may be highly critical of themselves and others and not realise this is because their parents were highly critical of them as a child. Another psychologist you'll recognise the name of probably is Carl Jung. Carl Jung worked between 1875 and 1961, and he contributed significantly to the development of psychodynamic theory. He developed what's called the Jungian theory. This places emphasis on the lifelong struggle we have and how our inner and outer worlds relate to how we personally develop and grow. Developing inner awareness about what we do to be creative and destructive, and as a result become psychologically stronger. Carl Jung was interested in myths, philosophy and religion. He developed what were called archetypes. These archetypes are of different aspects of our personalities, and he was fascinated by how storytelling and symbolism across many different cultures, traditions, religions, and across many millennia followed very similar patterns and interpretations over many thousands of years. Jung developed what he called archetypes. So, for example, the forces of good and evil, the witch mother, the tyrannical father, the wise old man and the wise old woman. He worked with Freud, but he separated from Freud in some of his theories, and he developed his own theory as he found that the focus on sexual instincts was just too limiting for him. Another area you'll be interested in under psychodynamic theory is analytical psychology, or psychoanalysis. This describes a way of healing the psyche, or the mind, by developing the personality through a process termed by Jung as the individuation process. The process of individuation is about human beings seeking wholeness in the future by making a link between the conscious and unconscious aspects of their psyche. To become whole, a person needs to reconcile and navigate the great maze in your mind of the different sides of personality, some of which may be undesirable. Only by working through the maze of our minds can we begin to reconcile our conscious and unconscious minds. During therapy, clients are encouraged to express their true feelings in a safe, non-judgmental space, and to express undesirable aspects of themselves so they can consciously reflect upon them. Neurosis or imbalance comes about from suppressing negative aspects of ourselves, so uncovering them is seen as the beginning of the healing process. This healing process aims to reach the goal of individuation. Another interesting aspect of psychodynamic theory is the development of the persona. Observing the persona a client adopts in their life can offer you insight into how a person is now and how they will play this part in the future. How someone behaves is judged externally by our societal norms and values, so supporting a client to gain an understanding of how they became socialised and how this can provide them with important information about their past and how they've adapted based on those experiences, and that these adaptations directly influence their reaction to future situations. For example, the client might present a persona at work that he's strong, unfeeling and determined, and yet at home his persona is quiet and affectionate with his family. We can each have many personas that we show the world. Within psychodynamic theory, it's important to observe the client, to observe whether they're an extrovert or an introvert, and how they orientate themselves, including their sensations, thinking, feeling and intuition, and how this gives insight into other areas of imbalance and conflict. People who are naturally one type and yet are pushed into being another type result in a disturbance of the psyche. So, for example, you might be supporting someone to consciously see that their discomfort may be due to them being an extrovert who's working in a solitary role, and this may help them see why they feel emotionally isolated and distressed. The client can then make changes to their life and enter a role that requires higher levels of sociability and interaction, which can then help them to achieve emotional balance. Psychodynamic theory provides certain tools for the counsellor today to use. These tools can enable a client to achieve a positive outcome. These include acknowledging that the unconscious mind has an important role to play in influencing someone's behaviour in the here and now. Psychodynamic theory can also help us identify that our behaviour is a result of past experiences, and that also our genetic inheritance can influence what is happening to us now. It also acknowledges that internal experiences relate to our relationships with others from the past and those that affect the present. It also helps us see that psychological problems often have their origins in the unconscious mind, and that in order to move forward, you need to bring issues from the unconscious mind into consciousness so the client can gain insight into their behaviour. This insight can help the person realise why they behave as they do and why they experience problems in the here and now. From this insight, they experience what Jungian theorists call catharsis, and this is the release of pent-up emotions. And from this release of emotions, many clients can resolve their problems. Another area which is very important within psychodynamic theory is transference and countertransference. This is not just a sole area for psychodynamic theorists, this is important for many other theories. But in particular within psychodynamic theory, close attention is paid to transference and countertransference. So first of all, transference happens when a client unconsciously transfers their emotions onto the counsellor. They relate feelings to the counsellor based on connections with significant people in their past and current lives, and especially those who are influenced their formative years. In the therapeutic setting, a client may identify with the therapist positively or negatively because they remind them of someone and they act accordingly to how they have acted with an old relationship from the past and how that relationship functioned. Countertransference, in comparison, is when the counsellor reacts to a client's emotions or attitude. This is an important tool to gain insight into the client's past, and this can occur when the therapist makes connections with the client based on their own experiences or how they respond to the client's emotions. In psychodynamic theory, if the therapist is inexperienced or misses these clues to the client's past, it could be significant in developing an accurate hypothesis for treatment and could potentially damage the client. The counsellor's role is to be alert to countertransference and work with the client to discuss the feelings or emotions they may be projecting onto the counsellor. Another person who contributed significantly to psychodynamic theory was Melanie Klein. She worked right up to 1960 and developed Kleinian counselling and psychotherapy. Her work continues today. She developed an acceptance of some of Freud's work on psychodynamic theory, but she devised very specific methods for working with children and adolescents. Her theory is called object-relations theory. Her work focused on bringing frightening thoughts and feelings into conscious understanding. This was in an effort to relieve distress while still remembering the thoughts. When applying object-relation theory, the therapist is looking for how the client expresses the relationship they have with family members, significant people in their early years, and any objects which they were attached to or where an attachment has been formed. And this can be things like a cuddly toy. It can also be things like alcohol or drugs. How the person then expresses these objects includes how they relate to their mother, the place or thing, the good or bad feelings they might express when relating to that object, and how they see themselves consciously and unconsciously in relation to others. This information provides insight into the person's development and how this has been shaped into their personality, their behaviour towards themselves, and how they behave to other people. The development of the self is formed in the very early years of development, and object relations theory points to the fact that we will often seek out other relationships that reaffirm those early self-object relationships. These patterns can be modified with support, but this can prove difficult the more traumatic the early experiences someone's had. Clients can often be stuck at a stage of their development and try to reenact this stage to find resolution, but often our needs remain unmet. Much of her work continues today to support children, adolescents, and families. Her work has greatly influenced therapies that have developed to help children who have had developmental delays or experienced trauma. Attachment theory is an important part of the psychodynamic theory and practice. This work was done in the early years by John Bowlby, Mary Ainsworth, and Donald Winnicott. They describe the impact of early childhood experiences and how this shapes how a person behaves, how they interact and respond to relationships in their lives. In their theory, every child needs at least one secure relationship with a caregiver so that they develop normally both emotionally and socially. When this caring and attached relationship is absent or intermittent, a child's development can suffer greatly, and its impact can be felt all the way into adulthood. These past experiences are not only the interest of psychodynamic theorists, but are of interest to all the different theoretical approaches in supporting people with their difficulties in life, which may have their origins in their infancy and childhood. So now we're going to move on to the second approach. This is the humanistic approaches, and these began to emerge in the 1940s and 50s. This approach rejected a number of important philosophical positions held by psychoanalysts and behaviouralists. Humanistic theorists like Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow, and Clark Mustaka developed approaches to treating the human condition that was very different to what had come before. Under the humanistic approach, we're going to look at person-centered therapy. Person-centered therapy is all about the here and now, and it focuses on the conscious mind. Unlike psychodynamic approaches, the focus is on what the client is experiencing now, their current behaviours, and understanding how they feel and how they are working and how they are living their life now. From this realisation, change can take place. The work of Abraham Maslow is extremely important within this area of work, and his work was described as the hierarchy of human needs. Maslow talked about the fact that if any part of the hierarchy is absent, then a person is unable to fulfill their full potential. Once our basic human needs for food, shelter, and sex are met, other human needs are sought, including safety of our physical being and the security of having employment and living in a safe environment psychologically. Having certain aspects of our human needs missing results in what's called incongruence or psychological disturbance. A person can achieve different parts of the hierarchy whilst other parts are missing at the same time. So, for example, a person may have a life of insecure employment and have poor health, and yet still have friendship and family support. Maslow argued that in order to meet our full potential, or in his words, to self-actualize, each part of the pyramid needs to be present. Having all aspects of our human needs met means we are able to accept ourselves and the world around us, and this includes acceptance of all other people, because we no longer resent them or feel we are in competition with them. This model is so helpful to use during therapy. Within person-centered therapy, the therapist is there to help the client regain their self-awareness about their feelings in relation to unsatisfied needs and enable them to view the resulting negative feelings in a non-threatening, objective manner. By accepting positive feelings, the client can strengthen their self-image and self-esteem, and from this position begin to address any gaps within their lives so that they can self-actualize. So what is person-centered theory, or PCT? Well, person-centered counselling theory was founded by Carl Rogers between the 1940s and developed further all the way into the 1980s. It moved away from the traditional models of a therapist as the expert and instead adopted a non-directive and empathetic approach to clients. PCT is a humanistic approach that assumes people inherently possess the desire for self-improvement. It believes that people have inner wisdom, and if given the right environment, they have the potential to help themselves. The helper leaves behind their own belief system, and they walk alongside the client in their world. The helper is not directive or deflected by the behaviour of the client, nor do they judge them or the progress they make. The client determines this. In PCT, the helper strives to provide the necessary and sufficient core conditions, including empathy, unconditional positive regard, congruence for the client, and this is displayed through non-possessive warmth, that attitude of friendliness, non-threatening body language, attitude and expressions. Carl Rogers identified the 3 core conditions that must be present in any therapeutic relationship for change to happen. These are unconditional positive regard, genuineness or congruence, and empathetic understanding. He believed that if a counsellor or helper is skilled in these areas, they can create an environment where a client can grow, where they can heal, and where they can move forward positively. So let's just look at these 3 core conditions in a little more detail. The 3 core conditions are inextricably woven together, and the absence of one of these conditions can impact on the ability of a client to open up, for them to talk about their story, or for them to feel safe to explore the changes they want to make. Irrespective of which theory you may or may not approach counselling in, these core conditions are constants in all the work that we do. As counsellors, we recognise that we are the ones who make the difference as to whether these core conditions are developed and indeed maintained throughout therapy. This is why in Module 1 we covered the need for self-development and self-awareness. Without self-development and self-awareness, we may not be able to develop these 3 core conditions and provide the environment that will enable the client to make the changes they want to make. So assuming that the 3 core conditions are present, a person can then freely and openly share their here and now in an atmosphere of trust. So throughout person-centered therapy, the client exercises a number of things. They exercise their free will, and they can work on whatever they choose and at their own pace. Person-centered therapy accepts that the client is the expert of how they feel. They know what feelings are buried, and they know what they wish to uncover. The client also takes responsibility for their problems and also finding the solutions. The therapist does not judge if the client's solutions are good or bad. This form of therapy was so different to the psychological approaches applied before Rogers and others adopted this humanistic approach. Before this time, the psychologist was very much the expert, and in terms of power, the therapist was in control, and they knew what was best for the client. In person-centered therapy, this was so radically different, such a massive departure from this approach, and from this foundation, many more approaches have been developed, where the client's voice is heard and it's central to treatment. the field of psychology began to open up, and it was no longer just the domain of white middle-class men working alone and acting as experts on the clients' lives. I just want to talk a little bit more about unconditional positive regard. Unconditional positive regard, or UPR, is when you accept someone with no conditions or judgment. This is easier said than done, as each of us brings with us our own belief system, what we think is right or wrong, our values, the judgments about what's acceptable, and we measure the world and indeed the people around us against our own standards. We use our own belief system to guide our decisions, and if something or someone does not share the same belief system as us, we may find it hard to relate to them, and indeed we may wish to avoid them, especially if their belief system is the opposite to our own. Unconditional positive regard is such a central part of person-centered theory. Some people have never experienced unconditional positive regard, and they have felt judged all of their lives. When people do experience unconditional positive regard, this can be profound. Being accepted for being you can give people the space to take responsibility for themselves, and it can really help them to make the changes they want to make, or indeed accept what they have already. Being accepted by someone else who does not expect anything in return, that still values you as a human being without judgment and is there for you, can be a very powerful experience for many. The second core condition within person-centered therapy is genuineness or congruence. This is about being open and honest with ourselves and being genuine towards our clients. Our approach to the client is influenced by how open we are. An effective helper needs to continually work on reaching a position where they are known to themselves and others. You'll remember from the work you did in Module 1 about using the Johari window. We need to realise that we are not the expert on someone else, and we are as vulnerable, imperfect and flawed as the next person. Encouraging reflection and self-awareness is so important to be truly comfortable about our inner world. And then, if we achieve this, we can genuinely accept ourselves and then be accepting of other people. Remember that clients may uncover unknown things about ourselves, which you must address if we are to be genuine. A client may share something with us that results in a strong reaction that we might be surprised by. If this is not addressed, this can prevent clients from being open about their issues and can damage their self-respect, as our true feelings as counsellors are leaked to them. Being genuine or congruent does not mean that we gush out all our feelings and emotions to our clients. It is about understanding ourselves and being genuine when we say how we feel, but recognising that someone else's experience will be and is very different from our own. The third core condition within person-centered theory is empathy. Empathy is defined as being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, both emotionally and mentally. We enter into the feelings and situation, but we do not climb in. We focus on supporting the client to find their own solutions and helping them choose what's right for them. Some helpers describe this as walking alongside the client in their experience. Studies have shown that showing empathy results in greater levels of trust between the client and the counsellor or helper, and this can create an environment where the client can begin to understand themselves and their issues better. Sympathy, however, is quite different. Sympathy is defined as feelings of pity and sorrow for someone else's misfortune. Being sympathetic is being able to feel what a situation is like for another person and offering them compassion. This approach does not necessarily help someone out of their situation. Yes, it may help to talk about a problem, but sympathy may keep them in this situation and give them the benefit of more attention. The ways in which to show empathy towards the client include not interrupting them and jumping in when they're talking, not dismissing the client's views or beliefs, not being judgmental. Being empathetic is showing understanding for the client's experience, but in and on their own terms. We don't get muddled up between our own and think, ah yes, that happened to me. Being empathetic is also about not talking too much. Empathy communicates both verbally and through body language to the client that you respect them and you are trying to understand what they're thinking rather than assuming or imposing your views upon them. Being empathetic comes easier to some people rather than others, but everyone can improve these skills through self-development. Some people find loving kindness meditation and mindfulness practices can increase their empathetic skills. Another important aspect of developing a strong therapeutic relationship is about how you listen. And this is about listening not just with your ears, but with all of your being. Actively listening without judgment to the client's explanation of their problems includes verbal and non-verbal cues. These help the helper understand the presenting issue. It provides insight into whether the here and now for this person is specific or if it's complicated, and how this is affecting them. Without rapport, the client is unlikely to share their story and their true feelings, and indeed, it is unlikely they'll regain their self-awareness about their feelings towards their unsatisfied needs. The person-centered therapist gives a solid commitment to be there for the client and has a strong desire for them to take control in an equal partnership. An important aspect to remember with the humanistic theory is that social conditioning has a great influence on people and how they behave. People are conditioned socially to behave in certain ways to gain acceptance with their families, friendship groups, and the wider society in which we live. Clients will behave in ways they have learnt from their past, and these skills they've developed have enabled them in some aspects to gain acceptance based on experience, even if that behaviour seems abnormal to us. In person-centered therapy, the helper has no conditions and accepts the client irrespective of their behaviour, giving unconditional positive regard to them. For some clients, this can be so dramatically important in terms of them moving forward. So just to summarise then, person-centered therapy focuses on insight arising from a person's feelings, and the main concepts include that people have free will to act. Clients take responsibility for themselves. Person-centered therapy doesn't use techniques, but instead relies upon the development of the therapeutic relationship to provide the right conditions so the client can self-heal. In person-centered therapy, the client focuses on their own subjective understanding of their situation, not that of someone else's. These are all very important differences between psychodynamic therapy and person-centered therapy. We're now going to move on to the third area, and this comes under the umbrella of cognitive behavioural approaches. This approach focuses on learning's role in developing both normal and abnormal behaviours. Some of the early theories that formed the development of this theoretical position you might be familiar with. You may have heard of Pavlov's dogs. Well, Ivan Pavlov made some important contributions to behaviour therapy by discovering what he called classical conditioning or associative learning. Pavlov's famous dogs were conditioned to react every time a bell rang. They would begin drooling when they heard the sound of the bell, and they associated this sound with the food, whether food appeared or not. Desensitization is a classical conditioning therapy in action. Today, certain techniques are used by therapists to help a client with, say, a phobia through repeated exposure to whatever it is that caused the anxiety. This includes flooding the senses so the client experiences the phobia to the point that exposure desensitizes them to the thing they have a phobic response to. Another important behaviorist was someone called Thorndike. He discovered what he called operant conditioning. This is a type of learning that relies on rewards and punishments to shape people's behavior. Several variations have developed since these behavior therapies' emergence in the 1950s. One variation is called cognitive behavioral therapy, and this focuses on both thoughts and behaviors. So let's have a look at what CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, is. Person-centered therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy is all about the here and now, and it focuses on the conscious mind. Unlike psychodynamic approaches, the focus is on what the client is experiencing now, their current behaviors, and understanding how they feel, and then working on how they live their life now and the changes they want to make for the future. So let's take a look at cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, you'll be more familiar with. The cognitive approach in psychology is relatively modern. It's a modern way to look at human behavior. It focuses on how we think and assumes that our thought processes affect the way we behave. It's based on the principle that our behavior is generated by a series of stimuli and responses to these thought processes. The word cognitive means knowing, and the key assumptions of this theory are that human behavior can be explained as a set of scientific processes, that our behavior can be explained as a series of responses to external stimuli. It assumes that behavior is controlled by our own thought processes as opposed to genetic factors. The model on the slide explains the cycle of thoughts creating feelings, feelings resulting in our behavior, and how behavior then reinforces our thoughts. CBT is based on the concept that changing unhelpful thinking patterns can have a positive impact on someone's emotions. The focus of therapy is to concentrate on identifying, analysing, and changing negative cognitions and behaviour. The forefather of CBT was called Aaron Beck. Aaron Beck devised the basis on what we know as CBT back in the 1960s. His work focused on the treatment of people with depression. It was a short-term therapy that focused on resolving problems that a client presented with. Its origins come from cognitive and behavioural psychology and the theories about normal and abnormal development. It can be a very effective treatment for many disorders including anxiety, depression, and concentration issues. The basis of CBT is that it accepts that in early life we develop cognitive thought processes as we develop our core beliefs. These are our norms, our values, and our views of the world and what we think is right and wrong. Our experiences and how we process these can result in irrational and often negative thoughts, which may lead to anxiety, poor self-esteem, and depression. The premise of CBT is that if you can alter the thoughts you have, you can alter how you react to them, and as a result, you can alter your behaviour. In CBT, the assumption is that the client can become aware of these thoughts and can take responsibility for changing them. It also assumes that the thoughts that result from the stimulus are often distorted and they do not reflect reality in an accurate way. It also assumes that the emotional distress you feel is a result of the distorted view of the situation. Using CBT in therapy. You and the person you're helping need to understand the connection between emotion, behaviour, and thoughts. This is called guided discovery. This can include the exploration of the client's past and the role this may play in how they react to certain stimuli. The focus is about how the client can use this knowledge to challenge their current behaviour and change it for future situations. So, for example, you might think that everyone is staring at you. This thought makes you feel agitated, sweaty, and nervous when you go out. This changes your behaviour, so you then avoid all social situations. By avoiding interacting with others, you become more isolated, and the thought of being around other people makes you even more anxious than you were before, so you avoid the interactions. The aim of CBT therapy is to interrupt the initial thought by a process of searching for evidence to support this thought. Then the client gradually begins to expose themselves to different situations to see what their reaction is and what the reaction of other people around them is, and is it like they thought before. They want to find out in reality what the experience really is. This experience then challenges that automatic negative thought, and the more and more evidence that's observed and experiences, the greater the challenge there is to the automatic negative thought. The client experiments with more and more social interactions, and they are now alert to this automatic negative thought and the things that trigger this reaction. The client then gets more and more exposure until they are able to cope and indeed begin to enjoy social interactions. Just like person-centered therapy, the core counselling skills used in CBT include encouraging the client to describe their problem, empathetic listening, summarising the main elements of the problem, and working very closely with the client to discover alternative strategies to deal with a problem more constructively in the future, and this is called synthesizing. CBT tends to be more structured and short-term therapy, usually between 6 or 12 weeks, with an appointment per week. These sessions are action-led and not just about talking about the presenting issue. This can be in one-to-ones or group sessions. In CBT, once a therapeutic relationship is established, the focus is on establishing what the client wants to work on and setting realistic goals. The focus then is on the client and therapist working together to establish what skills are needed to be developed and practiced, and these are both practiced in the therapy room and in the outside world. The understanding from the client is to see that our responses to things are often set in our childhoods, and that when we are aroused to certain things from the past that we have learnt from, like being frightened or anxious or angry, this distorts what's really going on around us. If we can adopt a more positive response and become calmer, we can then understand what is actually going on around us more accurately. Techniques in CBT to help slow down the automatic negative thoughts, things like keeping a diary of emotions and behaviours, can be very helpful. CBT aims to support the client from negative automatic thoughts to a place where they can recognise a more balanced thought about a situation or an experience. Here is an example of the kind of homework people get with CBT treatments. Homework is a very important part of CBT, and the responsibility is given to the client for completing it. The homework often involves the client trying out their new skills in real life, and then reporting back what the experience was like, what they've learnt about themselves and the results they've seen, and whether this confirmed or challenged their original automatic thought process. The client can then see they're capable of coping with a situation on their own without the therapist's intervention. The automatic thought process includes the external event or stimuli, the automatic thought, which is usually a negative one, the emotions that emerge from it, and then how this impacts on someone's behaviour, and this includes those thoughts from being anxious to catastrophizing. As I mentioned before, the wonderful thing about CBT treatment is that clients' own individual work to slow down the process can have significant results in terms of reducing depression and anxiety. So CBT includes interrupting automatic thoughts, questioning if these thoughts are accurate, what's the evidence to support it, about paying more attention to the reality of the situation and focusing on positive self-statements. It's also about looking at how we deal with setbacks now and in the future, and about learning self-help techniques including relaxation and mindfulness. All of these things combined within CBT can really improve someone's mental health. So just to summarise then, CBT focuses on insight arising from an understanding that thoughts create feelings, feelings result in our behaviour, and behaviour reinforces our thoughts. CBT treatment can help a client see the world differently from the world they may have created through their own automatic negative thoughts. So the main concepts are that human behaviour can be explained as a set of scientific processes. Our behaviour can be explained as a series of responses to external stimuli. That behaviour is controlled by our own thought processes as opposed to genetic factors. CBT assumes that people can be aware of their own thoughts and they can take responsibility for changing them, and that the thoughts that result from a stimulus are often distorted and do not reflect reality in an accurate way. It also assumes that thought processes can be changed to then enable someone to alter their behaviour in the future. So let's just have a quick recap on the three types of approaches and the differences between them, the differences between psychodynamic, humanistic and cognitive behavioural approaches. So the first area, psychodynamic theory. This focuses on an individual's unconscious thoughts that stem from the past, from childhood experiences, and it assumes that these now affect current behaviour and thoughts. Psychodynamic theorists believe that the urges that drive us come from our unconscious and we're driven by them to repeat our patterns of behaviour. The aim of insight through therapy that's gained about bringing unconscious material into consciousness helps the client move forward in terms of interpreting why they behave as they do. The aim is to make the unconscious conscious. This enables the client to gain insight. Therapy in this area includes things like free association, the analysis of resistance and transference, dream analysis and interpretation. Psychodynamic therapy can be open-ended. There can be many years of treatment that someone can have, and it's usually classed as a long-term treatment. It's very directive. The counsellor seeks understanding, and a major part of the approach is to interpret what's observed and feed this back to the client. The counsellor is a blank slate onto which the client can project. Transference and countertransference are key elements of this approach. Change occurs by means of uncovering repressed or significant events and examining their associated feelings. Through this process, change will occur, and the client will be better equipped to understand the connections between their past and present behaviour. Change occurs from the individual through the strengthening of the individual's ego. So now a summary of person-centered theory. Person-centered theory focuses on the belief that we are all born with an innate ability for psychological growth if the external circumstances around us allow us. It believes that clients become out of touch with their natural self-actualizing tendency, that they adopt the evaluations of others and thereby treat them as if they were their own beliefs. Person-centered theory is non-directive, so in the counselling relationship, the relationship in terms of core conditions is absolutely crucial. The conditions of empathy, congruence or genuineness, and unconditional positive regard are central. Clients are prized and valued, and they can learn to accept who they are and reconnect with their true selves. Person-centered theory has a very positive view of human nature and views the individual as not necessarily being a product of their past experiences, but it acknowledges that they are able to determine their own future. Person-centered theory deals with the conscious mind, the here and now, and focuses on current problems that arise for the client. It ignores the past events in the client's life unless these events affect the client's conditions of worth. Person-centered theory is all about improving the well-being of someone by means of working collaboratively. This collaborative therapeutic relationship enables and facilitates healthy coping mechanisms in clients who are in pain and disharmony with their own lives. Person-centered theory is viewed as having the client, having various experiences and developing a personality as a result of these subjective experiences. Person-centered therapy is usually a shorter-term therapy. The client is usually prepared for the eventual ending of sessions, and they're prepared in advance for the end of therapy. It's non-directive. The person-centered counsellor encourages the client to seek the solution to their problem within themselves and would not attempt interpretation. Person-centered therapists pay no attention to the issue of transference. They believe that change occurs with the core conditions being present: empathy, congruence or genuineness, and unconditional positive regard have to be in place. This relationship is all that is necessary to bring about change. Person-centered therapists believe that the individual can grow, and that by creating these conditions, the individual's self-actualizing tendency will materialize. And now a summary about cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT. CBT focuses on how an individual's thoughts and perceptions affect the way they feel and behave. Functioning or dysfunction are a learned response to external stimuli. CBT believes that we are reactive beings who respond to a variety of external stimuli, and our behaviour is a result of learning and conditioning. Behaviour is viewed as having been learned, therefore it can be unlearned. The focus is on developing a working alliance and using the core conditions of empathy, unconditional positive regard to make sure this is established. Helping clients recognise negative thought patterns so they can learn new positive ways of thinking is central to CBT, because this will ultimately affect their feelings and their behaviour. CBT believes that there's a positive view of human nature. It views the individual as not necessarily being a product of their past experiences, but acknowledges that they are able to determine their own future. CBT deals with the conscious mind, the here and now, and the focus on current problems and issues the clients may have. Improvement and well-being is achieved through a collaborative relationship between the therapist and the client. This therapeutic relationship enables and facilitates healthy coping mechanisms to be developed, so that clients who experience psychological pain and disharmony in their lives devise their own new positive methods to deal with their issues. Human experience is viewed as a product of the interacting elements of physiology, cognition, behaviour and emotion. CBT therapy tends to be short-term, and there tends to be a set period. The client is prepared for the ending of the sessions, and they're prepared in advance for this to happen. CBT is much more directive, and it's taught. It's goal-orientated and doesn't look to the past. The counsellor is directive, including setting homework for the client to work on. The process of change occurs by means of education, and by bringing these thought patterns into awareness. Change can also occur through reality testing and experimentation, where the client's negative beliefs are challenged and their subsequent negative emotions are eliminated. Before we finish this module, I just wanted to highlight what integrative approaches are, and indeed other approaches to therapy, and that you don't have to be a therapist who specialises in one area if that doesn't feel right for you. Integrative therapists like me are becoming much more common. This means that I'm trained in a whole range of areas. So my training has included psychodynamic theory, person-centered therapy, cognitive behavioural therapy, and I'm continually adding to my skill set. Most recently I've completed training on trauma therapy and EMDR. I always like to hear what it's like to be an integrative therapist, and this helped me at the beginning of my career. So I'd like to share with you a real-life example of just how this integrative approach can work in reality for our clients. To Share with you an example of someone that I worked with. I won't use their real name, and I've changed some of the details to protect the client. I had a client who came to see me about getting some support to reduce his alcohol intake. So let's call him John. The beginning of the therapy with John, I adopted a person-centered approach. This was for the first 2 or 3 sessions. And this was to enable us to develop a strong therapeutic relationship, and to enable John, who was pretty nervous, to share a story with me, and he explained some of the impacts that alcohol had had on his daily life. When he was telling me his story, John mentioned that life had been very hard for him, particularly as a child, but that he didn't want to talk about it. Together, John and I decided that his priority was to develop some positive coping skills and strategies, particularly when he got very stressed, because this was when he was drinking more. So throughout the next few sessions, I switched between person-centered approaches to a more directive approach. So I switched to using CBT techniques. So John kept a diary. He kept a diary which talked about his emotions, how much he was drinking, so that he was more consciously aware of what his habits were when he reacted to stress. John did successfully change some of his habits, and he began to implement these new ways of living, and he did stop drinking for a while. We finished the sessions, and I knew there were other things he needed to work on, but he just wasn't ready. So we said goodbye, and then a year later John rang me up and he said that he'd started drinking again. He said that the therapy initially had really helped him, and he was hopeful that I would be able to help him with what he needed to work on. This time, however, he said he wanted to tackle some stuff from his past. He was having more flashbacks and recurring memories, and in particular had 2 traumatic events that he said he just couldn't shake off. So we worked together, first of all, using person-centered therapy and CBT to help him stabilise his drinking, so that he was beginning to look after his physical as well as mental well-being throughout the next 3-4 weeks of sessions. When he was ready, he did begin to talk about the past and the traumatic events that had happened to him. I had been alert to these issues in the previous year when he talked about his relationship with his parents and all the disruption that he'd had as a child, and also that he'd had 2 very serious incidents that had happened in his life. John was very clear about the areas he knew he was struggling with, and he knew what triggered his drinking. So we talked about using some trauma therapy techniques, and in particular this one called eye movement desensitization processing, EMDR. So John decided he wanted to complete EMDR to address the traumatic events in particular, and we went through the process about what happened to him, and he was able to begin to process some of the things that happened in the past. Throughout the second phase of support, I switched between person-centered to CBT, I did some psychodynamic approaches, and finally I used some trauma therapy techniques, including EMDR. So I hope that example shows you that an integrative therapist can design a therapy plan that's flexible and responsive. So in John's case, I was able to provide him with the support that he needed when he was ready to move forward with certain aspects. I did know in the first phase that his past was one of the underlying reasons for his drinking, but he just wasn't ready to acknowledge this, and he was quite fearful about tackling it. I respected his wishes and I didn't push him. He's the expert of himself, and he knew when he was ready. So when he came back to me, he had already processed so much stuff about his life, and when he was talking about his life, he felt very different to the first time that I had met him. He was clear about what life he wanted in the future, and that he didn't want to be held back by his past. I hope this gives you an example of how all these theories, when you combine them in real life with real people, it can make a big difference. And developing those skills and adding on different therapies to your practice is really important so that you're able to provide that support for your client. You can't always provide everything for your client. So in John's case, I made a referral to an addiction specialist, and he was getting additional support there as well. So I hope you found that interesting, and I hope you enjoy the next module. Okay.